Hey, what's up everyone, and welcome to this week's installment of the Fabricator Series Segments, where every single week I upload one more chapter, sometimes two, of how to build a tube chassis front end, which is demonstrated on this S13. So, if you are not subscribed already to the Fabricator Series YouTube channel, absolutely go down right now and push that button so you don't miss the next week's uploads. If you're not familiar with the Fabricator Series, head over right now or after this video to the fabricatorseries.com, and there you'll find the build blogs on how to build a tube chassis front end, where each week there will be another episode posted, and in there you can get onto the discussion of everything, ask questions, talk about it amongst everybody else, and all kinds of other good stuff. There's also a lot of great stuff for you to learn while you're over there. You can also check up on facebook.com/thefabricatorseries. There's always another upload, another update, something else going on, and I'm also a big fan of Instagram, so head over to Instagram at the.fabricator. Check all the information below here, and I'll have all of that there. If you need to get a hold of me, send a message, drop a comment, drop me an email, do whatever you gotta do, and I always try to get back to you. So without any further delay, here's this week's episode of how to build a tube chassis front end. Okay, so let's move on to the upper core support. Now, there are a few ways of doing this, and it is actually really tricky to do. So here's the best way I found over the years to make this happen. You take a straight edge and you place it on the top of your radiator tank, or the top of your radiator if you have a cross flow design. And using that straight edge, we're just going to make a line on the tubes. Do the same thing on this side. I'm going to make sure it didn't pop out there, so we'll run it on this side. Make our line. So at these 2 points here, this is going to be the notate the top of the tube where I want it to actually mate. Top section will be right there. This does sit just slightly lower. I want the topmost section of the tube to be at the same height as the radiator end tank itself, because I still have to put the radiator stays on here, which are going to extend straight up and then weld directly to the tube. Now at this line here, we can mark out roughly an inch below. So we have our top height, our bottom height, and this is the total section, or this is the space where the tube will sit. So let's create a face line. Now at that point, this is where the tube will actually mate and run in front. So what I'm going to do is take my cheater and I'm going to set it up on here. There are two angles that I need to focus on right now. The first angle is looking straight at it, just like you are in the camera right now, or your view as you're viewing it on the video right now, and the other one is looking straight down on it. Okay, so on the top of it, I'll just put a couple of marks on here for reference. This is the center, and as we're looking at it around here, about this area here is the center. So what I'm looking at right now is, if I look down from the top and I look at it from the angle that we're looking at it right now, where do I find the center point on this tube? So it needs to be halfway between this tube and this tube with that mark, and it also needs to be halfway between this mark where it intersects at the face line here and the mark where it intersects at the face line here. So at both of those places here is where it needs to be centered, which is about right there. So now we translate that. What we're going to do is look around somewhere on here as it's lined up where it needs to be and say, what do we have that we can use as a reference? So let's look here at my lines. Okay, this line signifies the first point of deformation on the tube where it starts its bend. This line here is my reference line to place it in the die. So the die itself will line up on this line, and this is the offset it creates, or this is the point far away from where I line it up at the die where it actually starts to deform. So let's take a look here real quick. It's a little hard to see, but straight through this bubble wrap here, as I'm lined up where I need to be, is a weld. And that weld right there is the same on both sides. This side here and that side over there. They're exactly the same. So I'm going to use that as a reference. Now the way to reference that is to take a measurement from weld to weld. Looks like 25 inches. Okay. So with all of that information, we can go cut our piece of tubing, and I'll show you exactly how to make this end made up to that end in the middle of that radius and serve as our upper core support. Alrighty, so I found this tube here in my cut pile. Yeah, it's about 38 inches, so let's get to half of that, which would be 19 inches. Put our center line. So from weld to weld on the radiator, we had 25 inches of total length. Okay, so that 25 inches, half of that is 12.5 inches on each side. So let's mark our 12.5. Mark our 12.5 here. And we'll mark our 12.5 here on this side. Okay, now this is the tricky part. Those two marks here, or that area weld to weld, if we noticed on the cheater, it was actually the point of deformation. So we need to offset that to put it into my die to make sure that it actually lands at the right spot. It's 3/4 of an inch away from the point in my die where I line it up at the edge to the point of deformation is 3/4 of an inch. So we'll take this, offset mark 3/4 of an inch. This is where I will line it up in my bender at the die. I'll do the same thing over here. 3/4 of an inch. So again, to make sure that we understand about the line here, this line is the point where it actually has to mate up here at the die. So I'm going to route this in here. This is the point where the tube will actually first start deformation, or the bend will actually start impacting the tube and start to go. So I'm going to line it up at the beginning of the die, just like it is right there. We're going to set this up and get our offset correct. Just like I like to say in all of my videos, you got to make sure that everything is actually level. And the reason why 0 and 0 is when you line it up on here, you want to make sure that this reads 0 degrees. Because if you don't, you're going to have one tube, or one end of the tube that's going to go this way and the other one's going to go that way. I say it every time that I have to do this, just as a reminder, so that you know, always set your die up or set your tube up to make sure you're actually bending level. Okay, so we're at 0 degrees. Crank this down, and then we're going to put our bend on it. So let's run our fit check. Notice how as I'm sitting above the radiator at the point where I want it to be, the tube is actually starting to touch here, and we're very, very close to the sides at where we want everything to actually mount up to. So as we look straight down on it, we're actually right in the middle where we need to be. It's kind of a clever trick. I mean, you let math and whatnot do the work, and you go from there. But now the difficult part is going to be notching these tubes out. And I'm not going to lie, this is it's kind of tricky because the notch actually has to go in the middle of a bend radius. So it's going to be cut entirely by hand, of course, but you know, it's we'll just kind of work with it a little bit here and try to get it to go on there. So like in the tube notching video, this is a little bit different because the nature of this bend is kind of strange, but the baseline, the first one that signifies where I need to cut or where it's actually going to sit, is right there. My throat line, 1/3 tube diameter of a 1-inch tube, is about 1/3. So we're going to go to probably about right there. That's about where my throat line is going to be. So what I'm going to do is actually cut this off here, measure the same thing on the other side, cut that off, and then we'll actually mark out where our notches need to go. Alright, so we're going to line this up here. And you can kind of notice here that it's actually, the tube is sitting above the radiator, which means as we notch it out, it's going to sink right down exactly where we need it to go. So the tricky part here now is to create these notches. Now, I'm not going to lie, they're kind of a little bit difficult to make because the notches themselves have to be right in the middle of a bend radius. So it's a little bit backwards here, but kind of like the tube notching video here, I'm going to create my baseline. My baseline is the point at which I'm going to start the notching at, which in this case, as I set it up about where I want it to be, it's about half of this tube diameter. So I'm going to make my cuts starting here, and then we're going to set it up, kind of line it up where it needs to be, and then notch our tubes out. So we'll hold it up here. See, right where we land is exactly where we need to be in between those after we get it cut to length. So the tricky part now is going to be these notches. So what I'm going to do is just kind of neatly trace my 1/3 tube diameter throat depth on the top where I can see it. Now after I cut this section out here, I'm going to flip it over, and directly across from it 180 degrees I'm going to make that notch on there too. This is kind of all entirely up to your eyeballs to make, but we're going to undercut, of course, and then trim it out with the grinder, and then of course make both sides match. Alright, took a little doing, but I got these notches fit just right, and when you know it, we're actually sitting in the proper spot, right where we need to be. So with it held up where I want it, where I said the top of the tube was going to be the top of the radiator end tank, I'll make sure I check this out in a moment after I tack it in. We'll make sure it's level, but for right now, just drop a couple tacks down to make sure that we're sitting where we need to be. So we got our upper core support. Now for verification, right on 0 degrees, right where we need to be. So now we can finish by welding it up. So with the upper core support welded in, we can start working on this forward section here. Now I'm going to have to build a diffuser plate, the hood latch system, and of course the upper bumper brackets, so which also will tie into the headlight buckets on the side here where the motors are at. So this, I'm going to have to do some tubing work and then integrate some brackets into it and a whole lot more, but we need to first get a reference of where everything lines up at. Now my hood is actually set and does line up with this headlight bucket, and we've actually got to measure that and everything's good to go. So you can see the gap that I have here, it needs to come up a little bit, and then we need to have a reference line for placement because I obviously can't add the tubes while the hood is closed. So let's start with setting our hood up. Now up top we're doing okay, but on the side here we're a little bit off, but that's all right for right now. We'll go back and try to align all of that later. I'm just going to use a piece of masking tape. And I'm going to translate this line. This one signifies the edge of the hood. We'll make a little H there. And then about 1/4 of an inch or so away, we'll run a V for the bumper line. So when we lift up, I'll know about where it needs to land onto there. So now this hood, you notice if we lift it and space it just a little bit with the hood latch in there, it'll actually sit where it needs to be. So we'll be okay here. So I want to line the bumper up with this headlight at the line that we just created. So we need something that's going to actually hold the bumper up top, hold the tab to the bumper bracket, and then actually have a tube that runs off. In this section right here, I'm going to have the tube run off and actually made up to the upper radiator core support. And then we can sheet metal over and make our diffuser. But first we want to see what we can actually put in here. Now this section right here, to make this tab weld to this bracket here and make all of it bolt on with enough area on the side here to give a nice little tube support. The only thing I can come up with off the top of my head that would make a prime candidate for a bracket right there would be a piece of angle. And it looks like probably 1.5 inch angle would be the size that I need. So I'm going to take a measurement here between the side here and this section up top here, about how much space I have to work with. Looks like 4 inches is where it's going to fit in there. So I'm going to go cut a 4-inch piece of angle real quick. Right, so this one might be just a little bit tricky to manage here, but I'm just going to slide that in there and kind of play around with it here. I need to try and get this bumper to line up with this upper line here and get these 2 holes and everything else lined up as well. So for right now, let me try to get some marks for the holes to be drilled. And then this point right here is about where that weld tab's going to go on. But let me get the holes in there first, and then we'll worry about getting it bolted down and with the weld tab on it. Now these holes only need to clear an 8mm hole, but I went up to just under 10mm to make sure that everything comes out clean and clears easily. I'm just going to kind of work on this bumper a little bit. It's going to be a little tough to get lined up right, but right where that tab touches, That's where I want that tack to go. Nice and sturdy. There we go. Got my height set right about where it needs to be, which is looking great. We have some adjustability because of our enlarged holes and slides, so I'm going to put down a really heavy weld on this one. And then our tube is going to hold everything in place right where it needs to be. An old friend of mine actually brought up to me one time that my building style is kind of like a combination of grace and aggression. So I really do like that term, or how he describes it. I like to try and keep a flow, or really incorporate a nice smooth design, but with a really aggressive status that always tries to scream, come on and mess with me. You know, it's just one of those things I like to do. I like to get really creative. So instead of just one way or another, I'll try to incorporate a few. So in this case, I found a couple of pieces. These I bent earlier on a different project that I was working on, and they just happened to be cut off at 70 degrees. Both of them were exactly the same, so I'm going to try and use these. We're going to do for some, go for some really crazy notching here, because I would like to kind of take off almost tangent to this bend right here and swing around and get right down into the bracket that we just welded on there, and I'm going to use these tubes to do it. So pretty crazy notching that's going to have to be done, but that's all right. We already know how to do that thanks to the tube notching video and a lot of practice. So I'm going to hold this up here, and of course it's going to have to be moved this way, but I'm going to do a trim line, or actually, you know what, we're going to start with the notch itself. We'll use this section here is going to be the base of our notch, so I'm just going to start with where the face line is going to land here, and we're going to cut it down just like this. Now this is definitely one seriously crazy notch, so that's my throat line right there. And up top here, let's see, do a 180 degrees directly across, right about there from where this one is. And I'm going to go right down to my throat line again, so I can feed this into the saw. This is going to be one seriously awesome notch here, so let's see if we can get it right on the first shot. Alright, now after chasing that out with the grinder, let's see how well we're fitting. That looks pretty freaking good. So now we got to be able to scoot it over here so it becomes tangent to this radius right here. It'll take off of that, and that'll look really cool bending all the way around there. But in order to make it fit up to our plate, our angle that we mounted down here to our bumper bracket, we're going to need to trim off at the correct angle. So I'm just holding it up there and tracing along at this angle. You notice it's actually kind of diagonal cut there. So what I'm going to do is, when I place this in the saw, I'm going to cut at that angle. Okay, let's start up top here. That's pretty close. Now I'd like to make sure that I maintain 90 degrees here, so I'm just going to hold it in and then we'll go back and check it. Just a really solid tack to start off. Make sure I'm lined up where I need to be. That's pretty stout. Great fit, look at that, I like that. So let's check that we're at 90 degrees. So to ensure that we stay at 90 degrees, I'll put my holding magnet in the corner here. Make sure that we're still on our tab right where we need to be, which we are. Get this line up one more time here. Make sure that we're up on our line, our height is set correctly, and go down a hardcore tack on it. Hold that till it cools just a moment. Alright, looks like we're solid. We'll put another one here in the corner. And another one on the inside here. Awesome. And there's there's our first bumper bracket. I'm going to hold that in place and then take a measurement from here to the center of the upper tube. And on the opposite side here, when I measured, I got 6 3/4 of an inch, which to that line, I'm right there on that spot, right where I need to be. So I'm going to take my marker and make my line. Now this side and this side are exactly where they need to be, just like they were before, and I have my line ready to cut. Both sides will be exactly the same when I get it ready to weld on. So I'm going to go cut this right now. Alright, so tube number 2. Let's get this measured in. Set up correctly. Now I already measured it up and made sure that it's the exact same size as the other side. Cut to length and everything correct. So, just make sure that we line up correctly where we need to be placed on the bumper bracket itself. I'm going to toss another tack weld in here as soon as I verify. So we make sure that our height actually gets set correctly as well, versus the other side. Before we get too crazy with these welds, I want to make sure that both of our tubes up front measure out correctly. We have both sitting at a slope of 20 degrees. So that means we should be good to go. I'm sure we still have the same measurements as we did before, right where everything needs to be. Looks like we're good to go. So I'm going to put down the rest of the heavy welds on these and we're ready to move on to the diffuser. So I've got the front bumper off and we can see where the bumper bracket actually sits underneath here, so that'll prevent that nice little droop that you end up seeing with a lot of front ends where they leave the bracket out for whatever reason. But we also do need to reinforce this because as it just hangs off the front of here, you know, to me it's just not quite enough to actually keep all of the everything, you know, in place where it needs to be and strong and true. So we do need to reinforce underneath this to make sure that all of the rest of this is held up and tied in. But you notice here we're actually going to place the AC condenser in the front here in a V-mount fashion, and this is what's really great about this at the same time is that even if you look through the front of it, this whole front end conceals the tube chassis that we have going on under here, and even if you look through, you'll still see the AC condenser, which makes it look, you know, completely bone stock underneath, which is just one of those little clever features. But we do have to figure out how we're going to service the AC condenser. So if we ever have to take it out, he doesn't want to keep it anymore, you know, swap it out for an intercooler later, whatever the case is, we need to figure out how to service this. So rather than trying to send it through toward the rear for servicing and whatnot, I'd rather have it slide out actually through the front if you take the bumper off. So to make this nice and easy, we need to build a set of brackets for the top, or a couple of stays, places where they'll bolt in, and we'll also have to build for the bottom stays, or the lower stays for it. But these holes are going to have to be drilled out before we actually fabricate this bracket, because we're going to need the space with the drill and everything to get inside of there. It's going to be kind of difficult to do. So I'm going to take the bumper bracket back off, and we'll actually have a look at everything that we've got going on over here. Alright, so thinking accessibility here, I'm going to have to drill out a hole here and a hole here at both of these angles, and that's going to be a little bit tricky, but we'll be able to get that done. The headlight buckets might have to end up coming out. Let me see by cranking one of these up if I can actually access that area inside of there with the drill, and the answer is no. I'm going to actually take this bucket and this bucket back out. Since they're already lined up and everything's good to go, all I have to do is unbolt it, very simple, and then we'll get these holes marked out and drilled. Okay, so it's a little bit tricky to get this mounted in the correct location, so we're just going to set this up in place right about where it needs to be. I'm going to take my punch here, I'm going to send it through, I'm going to put a couple of marks on the tube. There's the location that we need to drill. All right, so we got the pilot set to where it needs to be, and at the angle that we're going to drill this into is going to be kind of clever how we're going to get it with some pieces in the way here. But my intention is to send this fabricated tube mount into the tube where I'm going to add a threaded rivet or a riv nut to it, and then I'll weld this on here, and then the condenser will have a place to mount. So we just need to pop it over with the hole saw real quick. Now you might notice it's a little bit wobbly, and that is intentional. And the reason why I use a wobbly bit is to allow me to give a little bit of wiggle room on that fabricated tube mount so we can get the condenser position set just right. So since it is a little bit wobbly on here, I'm going to let the drill do the work and not necessarily my hands. I'm not going to force it much. I'm just going to let it chew its way through there. So to get everything in here, all I did was take my fabricated tube mounts with the threaded insert and actually stuck them onto the condenser itself. So there's one on each side, and they're both automatically set to the correct angle that they need to be. So I'm going to slide this in, and we're going to get that set up and in place. I'm going to take a couple of little love taps here. Now I have it mounted right where I want it to be. Now we definitely don't want to burn the bushings that are holding the AC condenser on there, so just a couple of tacks to make sure that the port or bung itself absolutely does not move. So very small. Try to keep the heat down. You want to try and move swiftly so you can hurry up and get these off of there without burning them up. There we go. Get that out of the way, I can finish getting everything else welded in. Since I'd like to maintain serviceability of the whole front end here, I'm not going to incorporate the bumper bracket into the rest of the system here. So I'm going to have to build a tube that will go from the point on this side of the bash bar mount to this side of the bash bar mount and hold underneath the bumper bracket, and that will be the area in which we can build our diffuser plate and all the rest of it that goes in there, and we can still maintain our serviceability of removing the AC condenser from the front just like we designed. In the future, if we switch this out to an intercooler, we'll still allow enough clearance to slide the intercooler in and out just the same as we do with the AC condenser. So to start off here, I want to bend this tube from this bar across the front down to this bar over here, and each side is going to be behind the bungs that we just welded in. So let's start by holding this parallel to the main chassis rail and with the bash bar bumper, or the bash bar bracket that we built earlier. We're going to hold this completely parallel to it. I'm just going to kind of hold this up as I eyeball it, get it right in the place where I want it. I'm going to make a mark right here on this bracket. I'm going to do the exact same thing on this side. Hold it up parallel. My mark on the bracket. Now let's take a measurement. Looks like I have exactly 22¼ inches in between each one of these marks here. So I'm going to mark out my tube, start from the center, outward. We're going to have 22¼ inches in between each bend, kick them both downward, make sure we leave lots of material on there, and then we'll get back to here and get this all cut up with the bumper bracket back on the top. Okay, we got the tube all bent up. Have the bumper bracket back in. It's bolted in securely. I do have it adjusted accordingly to where I want it. Now, we got two different modes that I'm going to shoot for here. With the bumper on and without the bumper on. Now, you might just be wondering exactly what that means. Well, I'd like this to be able to be displayed, run, driven, put into competition, whatever the case is, with and without the bumper attached to it. So, this bumper bracket will obviously go away. Now, what I'd like to do, instead of having this kind of strange looking clumpy design or whatever the case is, I'm going to try and maintain this 20° angle as it transitions downward to the upper portion of the bash bar. Now this bar that we fabricated earlier, which is our lower bracket or our forward bracket for the upper radiator core support, will also serve as the point where that diffuser starts, or that diffuser plate starts, so we can channel and funnel all of our air in. So this has to be in place, and obviously the height of this front bar here is going to be determined off of this angle up here. So in order to get all of this right here, I'm going to start with creating a point in which I can mount pieces of steel up here that go along with this angle. Just going to use a couple of pony clamps to hold everything in place. So now when I hold this bracket, this tube up here, I'll get underneath here, figure out about where I want it to land, and then I'm going to clamp it down. Which actually, I'm just going to clamp it right here now to make life a little easier. So now I can crawl under here and figure out where we're at. The purpose of being under here now is to get this initial angle. If we look carefully, and if you did the same thing on the same chassis with this same bracket, you'll notice there's a bit of a recess that's underneath here. I'm going to aim for it to be in that area. Now it's not going to be actually tucked up in there because of this 20° angle that we're sitting at, but that's just kind of where I want it to be. It's a good reference point. So what I'm going to do is kind of line this up here. And you'll notice where we have it sitting. We can actually trace the inside here. But I'm going to get this lined up pretty close to where I need it. I'm going to take a measure here from the side of the tube to the bracket. Looks to be about 1.5 inches. That's a decent starting point. We got about the same on this side, 1.5 inches on both sides. So I'm going to go ahead and make my marks here on the tube. Just kind of hold it in place. Now I'm letting gravity really do the work here as far as positioning this is concerned. So we'll just get a couple of marks on here, which demonstrates the angle at which this needs to be cut. And we'll take all this back out, cut it up, make our gradual notch, and then fit it all up together and see how close we are. I've got my notching actually pretty close now, so I'm going to take a smaller piece of steel, and actually a thinner piece, make sure that we're set up correctly. Once again, keep that handy there. I'm going to put this on the underside as opposed to the upper where we had it before. This is going to give me a much closer reference as to exactly where that bar needs to sit. Make sure that this stays right where it needs to. I'm going to have my protractor handy here. Set the bar in place right about where it needs to be. And it touches, just barely touches, right at that 20° mark. What I'm going to do is hold my angle finder or my protractor in here and make sure that this says 0 degrees, that both sides are exactly the same. Which it does. And we're going to give it a tack. So just a little bit of a tack weld to get it in place here, and then we'll worry about measuring everything out and making sure that it actually lands in the correct spot and everything else. We have a little bit of wiggle room. So we'll worry about that in just a few minutes, but right now, just want to get that tack weld in. just take a couple of measurements. I'm going to use general reference points. We'll just go right to the tube itself. So about halfway across the top, I got 8 inches there. And here we got about the same. Hey, lucky shot. We got it right on the first try, and we don't have to worry about tweaking that out anymore. So what I'm going to do is get the rest of this welded in. Kind of look at everything else. We're going to stick this back on the top here. Let's just, for the sake of saying that we checked it. This is 0. This is 0. If we hold, let's say, a piece of flat stock here, 20 degrees. Of course, we're still 20 there, so we're good to go. Okay, so this next notch might be just a little bit ambitious, but you know what? I'm going to try and run away with these tangent lines here and kind of keep to that same motif here. I got a really cool vision in mind about how I'd like it to look. So I'm going to take this notch here, which I already cut out, and we're going to set it up in there. We're going to cut that evenly and try to make it go. So I'm going to show you how I got this kind of a crazy looking notch here. It's just a little bit extra here. I'm sure at your level by now you might be able to get this easily, but for the others that might not know how to do that, hey, let's show you how to do it. I'm actually starting off here with a piece of a bend that I actually pulled straight out of the cut pile, or my recycle pile. So both of these were already cut to the same, and we also cut them off at the same height and length and everything like that. So the bend itself needs to run perpendicular to the tube here. So what I'm going to do is use this section of the bend itself as part of the notch, and I'm just going to make a cut straight down. So I'm going to place it into the saw. I'm just going to try and line this up kind of about where I want it. Kind of crafty. Cut straight down. Now at this point, if we were to try and stick it on here, it would actually sit about like that, which is not quite the right angle. We need it to come back a little bit, so we need to cut down the back of this just a little bit. I'm going to do that with the grinder. Pretty simple. That right there should mate up beautifully right at the angle that we need it to. And if not, we'll follow the golden rule. And you can always take metal away, but you can't necessarily put it back on. So this might have been just a little bit undercut, and we'll see how we land. Now comes the hard part. What we're going to do is when we set this up, one, of course, it has to maintain this same angle. And two, we have to also maintain that same 20-degree angle as it slopes downward. So as I hold it up here, I want to try and make sure that these two tubes are as parallel as possible. And if the notch fits about right, everything looks good. So I'm going to trace this out. And that's the cut that we have to make. Very, very tricky with the saw, but that's what we got to make. Alright, so this is the angle that we got to cut here. Now you might wonder, how could we possibly manage that cut? It's a little tricky. Now, definitely, you can't just sit here and hold it in by hand, and there's not enough material, of course, in the on the tube here to stick it in the jaw, and at the same time, it has to be set up at a certain height, because as we cut it down at this angle here, that's the way it needs to be cut there, and that's going to be on the top, so we can't quite cut it that way. What we're going to do, I'm going to lock it into a set of locking pliers. And I'm going to set my angle in those pliers. I'm going to go back here and set my cut angle. We're going to crank this down. That looks to be about correct. Now we have lots holding it in here, so I decided I'm going to undercut this by a little bit. You can always take metal away, but you can't necessarily put it back on, so I have it sitting right about where I want it. Let's let the saw do the work. Let's see how close we are now. Look at that. All we gotta do is trim the edge off of there. We're right where we need to be. Pretty neat little trick. All right. Well, that pretty much wraps up the front section here. Now there are a couple other pieces that we need to stick in here, but I'm going to finish getting all this welded and we'll move on.